Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. The morning after Luna's arrival found Mira waking not to an alarm, but to the gentle rhythm of that same peaceful humming, now woven so seamlessly into the cottage's atmosphere that it felt like the house itself had learned to breathe. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains with unusual softness, as if the very photons had been asked to tread lightly around the sleeping child. Luna lay in the makeshift crib Mira had fashioned from a drawer lined with her softest cardigans, tiny fingers reaching toward patterns of light that danced across the ceiling in slow, mesmerizing spirals. When Mira leaned over to check on her unexpected guest, Luna's dark eyes found hers immediately, and again came that extraordinary stillness, not the absence of sound but the presence of perfect peace. Time didn't stop, but it certainly slowed, enough for both of them to acknowledge the profound shift that had occurred in their lives during the space between one midnight and the next. The first visitor arrived with the scent of fresh bread and morning dew. Mrs. Chen from the bakery knocked softly, then entered with the easy familiarity of small-town life, her arms laden with warm loaves and her eyes bright with gentle curiosity. The moment she crossed the threshold, her voice automatically softened, her shoulders dropped, and she found herself moving with the careful grace usually reserved for libraries and cathedrals. "Well," she whispered, approaching the makeshift crib, "she's clearly meant to be here." And somehow, that simple declaration seemed to settle the matter entirely. Others followed throughout the morning. Thomas the postman with a letter addressed simply to the Keeper of New Beginnings. Old Mrs. Hartwell with a quilt that smelled of lavender and decades of love. Young Jamie from the flower shop with a single white rose that seemed to glow in Luna's presence. Each visitor experienced the same gentle phenomenon. Their breathing would slow, their voices would soften, and they would leave feeling more rested than they had in weeks. Though none could quite explain why, by afternoon, Henrik the clockmaker appeared at Mira's door, his weathered face wearing an expression of profound recognition. He had been the one working on the town clock when it paused the night before, and he carried with him the particular gravity of someone who understood the significance of what had occurred. "My grandfather told me stories," he said, settling into the rocking chair by the window with careful movements, "about children who arrive when the world needs them most, born in the spaces where time bends just enough to allow impossible things." His eyes found Luna, who was regarding him with that ancient calm. "They come carrying gifts that the world doesn't know it needs yet." As if responding to his words, Luna's gentle humming began again, and something remarkable happened. The light in the cottage seemed to deepen and warm, and outside Mira could see children beginning to gather on the small patch of grass near her garden gate. They weren't playing in their usual boisterous way, but sitting quietly, drawing patterns in the earth with sticks, their faces serene as they listened to something only they could hear. Luna, it seemed, was already beginning to teach Willowmere something it had forgotten: how to breathe more deeply, how to listen more closely to the gentle rhythms that connected all living things. As evening approached and the visitors gradually departed, each carrying with them a piece of that profound peace, Mira understood that her life had become the opening chapter of something much larger than herself. Outside, the clock tower chimed 6 o'clock with perfect precision, but somehow the sound felt softer, more musical than before, as if even time itself was learning to move with greater gentleness through their small corner of the world. The days that followed wove themselves into a gentle rhythm, and by the end of Luna's first month in Willowmere, Mira had established a new routine that felt as natural as breathing. Each morning, after the cottage had filled with its quota of soft sunlight, and Luna had finished her breakfast of warm milk and wonder, they would make their way down the cobblestone path to the library. Luna rode in a basket, lined with one of Mira's softest shawls, her dark eyes taking in the world with that same ancient calm that made even the sparrows seem to fly more quietly overhead. The library welcomed them like an old friend opening its arms. Built of honey-colored stone, and filled with the particular silence that only comes from thousands of stories resting peacefully together, it had always been Mira's sanctuary. But with Luna's arrival, something subtle shifted in the building's very bones. The dust motes that danced in the morning light seemed to move with more purpose, and the leather-bound volumes on the highest shelves appeared to lean forward slightly, as if listening for something they had long forgotten how to hear. Mira would settle Luna in her basket near the circulation desk, where the baby could watch the gentle ballet of daily library life, patrons arriving with the reverent quiet of those entering sacred space, books being returned with the careful tenderness of borrowed treasures being restored to their proper homes. It was during one of these peaceful mornings, 3 weeks after Luna's arrival, that Mira first noticed the whispers. She had been processing a return, a slim volume of poetry bound in faded blue cloth, when she heard what sounded like the softest of conversations coming from somewhere near her elbow. The words weren't clear, more like the murmur of voices in another room, but they carried with them a distinct emotional temperature, the warm satisfaction of recognition, the gentle ache of remembrance. When Mira looked around, she saw only Luna, watching her with those knowing eyes, and the returned book lying open in her hands. Curious, Mira turned a page, and the whispers grew slightly clearer. Not the printed words themselves, but something else entirely. Emotional echoes, she realized with growing wonder, left behind by previous readers like invisible fingerprints on the margins. A young woman's joy at finding the perfect words for her own heartbreak, an elderly man's tears over a verse that reminded him of his late wife, a teenager's fierce recognition of feelings she had thought were hers alone. Luna's gentle humming began then, that same barely there melody that had announced her arrival, and suddenly Mira could not only hear these emotional whispers, but almost see them, threads of silver and gold light weaving between the lines of text, connecting each reader's heart to every other heart that had ever found solace in these particular words. The baby wasn't creating this magic, Mira understood with a clarity that settled in her bones like truth. She was simply helping the world remember that it had always been there, waiting patiently for someone to listen with enough gentleness to hear. As word of this quiet miracle spread through Willowmere's network of kitchen conversations and garden gate confidences, the library began to fill with visitors seeking something they couldn't quite name. They would sit in the reading chairs with books they had loved years ago, or browse the shelves with the particular attention of people who had learned that stories might whisper back if approached with proper reverence. Children began to gather around Luna's basket, not to play, but to simply be present in the expanding circle of peace that seemed to emanate from her like warmth from a hearth. 7-year-old Emma Reeves, whose grandmother had taught her to listen for the spaces between words, was the first to put the feeling into language. "She helps things remember how to be gentle," Emma whispered to Mira one afternoon, her small hand resting lightly on the edge of Luna's basket. "Like she's reminding the books that they're not just stories, they're all the people who ever loved them." And in that moment, as Luna's humming rose to meet the whispered conversations of 1,000 invisible readers, Mira knew that their little library had become something unprecedented, a place where the boundary between story and soul had grown beautifully, mysteriously thin. It was Emma who brought Ezra to meet Luna, appearing at the library's oak doors the very next morning, with a boy whose presence seemed to carry its own particular quality of stillness. Ezra moved with the careful attention of someone who had learned to listen for things that others missed entirely. His steps measured and his head tilted slightly, as if he were always on the verge of hearing something wonderful just beyond the reach of ordinary ears. "This is the boy I told you about," Emma whispered to Mira, her small hand resting protectively on Ezra's shoulder, the one who saves the quiet parts. At 8 years old, Ezra had already developed what the adults in Willowmere called an unusual collection, though they said it with the fond bewilderment of people who had learned that some children see treasures in the most unexpected places. He carried with him a worn leather satchel that clinked softly as he walked, not with the sound of coins or marbles, but with something far more delicate, the gentle percussion of glass touching glass. When Emma led him to where Luna sat surrounded by picture books, whose emotional whispers had grown familiar as lullabies, Ezra stopped and stood perfectly still for a long moment. His eyes found Luna's, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with words and everything to do with recognition. Slowly, reverently, he reached into his satchel and withdrew a small mason jar sealed with a cork, its contents appearing to be nothing more than captured air. "I collected this yesterday at dawn," he said to Luna, his voice carrying the serious reverence of someone presenting a gift of immense value. "It's the silence that lives between the first bird's song and the second." He unscrewed the jar with movements so careful they seemed choreographed, and the moment he lifted the lid, something extraordinary happened. The library's already peaceful atmosphere deepened into something approaching the sacred. The emotional whispers that danced through the books seemed to pause respectfully, making space for this particular variety of quiet to unfold like a blessing. Luna's response was immediate and unmistakable. Her gentle humming began, but this time it seemed to harmonize with the released silence, creating something that existed in the space between sound and stillness. The jar in Ezra's hands began to glow with the faintest silver light, and everyone in the library, patrons browsing the stacks, children selecting picture books, even Mira behind the circulation desk, found their breathing slowing to match some deeper rhythm they hadn't known they'd been missing. "She can hear them," Ezra whispered to Emma, his eyes bright with the wonder of someone who had finally found another person who understood that the world was full of invisible treasures. "She can hear all the spaces where peace lives." From his satchel he produced 2 more jars, each labeled in his careful handwriting, "The pause before laughter and mourning, before thoughts begin." As he opened each one in turn, Luna's humming shifted and changed, welcoming each variety of quiet like an old friend returning home. Mira watched this gentle ceremony unfold, understanding that she was witnessing the beginning of something that would change not just the library, but the very heart of Willowmere itself. Outside, she could hear the distant chiming of Henrik's clock shop, where time was measured not just in minutes and hours, but in the spaces between moments where magic quietly made its home. The afternoon stretched before them like an unwritten page, full of possibility and the promise of deeper mysteries yet to be discovered. The gentle percussion of clockwork drifted through the library's afternoon quiet, carried on a breeze that seemed to move with the same careful rhythm that governed Ezra's collection of silences. Henrik's shop sat just beyond the town square, but today the familiar sound of his work held a different quality, more musical, more intentional, as if each tick and chime were being tuned to harmonize with the whispered conversations still dancing through the library's books. It was during this peaceful hour, as Luna's humming wove itself through the emotional echoes of countless readers, that a girl appeared in the doorway. She moved with steps that seemed to match the distant clockwork, her dark hair catching the golden afternoon light, and her eyes holding the particular focus of someone who had learned to see time not as a simple progression of moments, but as something far more intricate and alive. "That's Sage," Emma whispered, though none of them had ever seen her before. In Willowmere, sometimes you simply knew people's names the way you knew the sound of rain or the color of evening sky. "Her father fixes the places where time gets tangled." Sage approached Luna's corner with the careful attention of someone who understood that she was witnessing something rare and precious. Her gaze moved between the baby and Ezra's collection of captured quiets, with the recognition of one specialist acknowledging another. When she knelt beside Luna's basket, she extended one small hand, revealing a delicate pocket watch that ticked with a sound like gentle heartbeats. "She lives in the spaces between moments, doesn't she?" Sage said, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact wonder of someone who had grown up surrounded by temporal mysteries. "The places where one second becomes the next, where healing happens so quietly that most people never notice." Luna's humming began again, synchronizing perfectly with the pocket watch's rhythm. And suddenly the library felt like the inside of a music box, where time itself had learned to dance. The emotional whispers from the books grew clearer, more distinct, and Mira realized she was witnessing something unprecedented. 3 children whose gifts complemented each other like instruments in the gentlest of orchestras. "My father says some people are born knowing how to help time remember its purpose," Sage continued, settling beside Ezra with the easy grace of someone finding her place in a constellation. "But she doesn't just help it remember, she teaches it how to carry people more gently." As if responding to this understanding, Luna reached one tiny hand toward the pocket watch, and the moment her fingers touched its warm surface, something extraordinary occurred. The afternoon light streaming through the windows seemed to deepen and warm, and everyone present felt a profound sense of connection, not just to each other, But to every person who had ever found comfort within these walls, every reader who had discovered solace in the space between one page and the next, the sensation lasted only a moment, but it left behind the gentle certainty that they were part of something much larger than their individual lives. Henrik's clockwork continued its musical rhythm from down the street, and somewhere in the distance, the town's bells began to chime the hour with unusual harmony, as if all the timepieces in Willowmere were learning to sing together. "She's teaching time how to be kinder," Sage whispered, and in her voice was the awe of someone who had spent her life around temporal mechanics, but had never seen anything quite like this gentle magic that asked for nothing more than the willingness to pause, to breathe, to remember that every moment contained infinite possibilities for healing. The Yamware synchronized harmony of timepieces and collected silences had barely settled into the library's afternoon, quiet when Sage rose with the fluid, certainty of someone following an invisible thread. Her pocket watch continued its gentle heartbeat as she moved toward the tall windows, where golden light painted rectangles of warmth across worn wooden floors. Luna's ancient eyes tracked her movement, while Ezra carefully sealed his jars, sensing their peaceful gathering was about to expand into something larger. "There's a place my grandmother showed me once," Sage said, her voice carrying the particular weight of remembered wonder. "Behind the old greenhouse, where she said impossible things grow when the world isn't watching too closely." Mira felt that familiar stirring in her chest, the gentle compass that had guided her since Luna's arrival, telling her when something was exactly right, even when logic suggested otherwise. She gathered Luna in the soft blue shawl that had become their traveling cocoon, while Ezra shouldered his satchel with reverent care. They slipped through the library's rarely used back door, past the forgotten courtyard, where ivy had claimed the walls with patient determination. The path beyond wound through overgrown rose bushes that sighed with decades of accumulated perfume, leading to a space where the afternoon light seemed to gather with unusual intensity, creating an aureole of warmth that made the very air shimmer. There was no gate, no formal entrance, just a gradual thinning of the undergrowth that revealed something extraordinary. The Garden of Almost was stretched before them like a living poem, where reality had grown soft around the edges and possibility bloomed in colors that existed only in the spaces between memory and dream. Flowers here defied earthly taxonomy, their petals shifting through hues that belonged to emotions rather than spectrums. The deep purple of a comfort almost offered, the silver green of forgiveness nearly spoken, the gold of joy that had hovered just beyond reach. Trees bore fruit shaped like crystallized wishes, and a gentle breeze carried the murmur of conversations that had almost happened, apologies that had trembled on the edge of being voiced. Luna's humming began the moment they crossed the threshold, harmonizing with sounds that emerged from the garden itself, dewdrops falling upward in gentle percussion, sunlight learning to sing in whispered melodies. As her voice wove through the air, the colors deepened, the almost sense grew clearer, and the murmurs of what if became nearly intelligible. Ezra found himself drawn to a cluster of silver-leafed plants whose buds had been hovering between closed and open for what seemed like years. He released the breath before saying yes from one of his jars and watched as they exhaled into bloom in unhurried sequence, each flower revealing possibilities that had been waiting patiently for permission to exist. Sage knelt beside a low tree whose branches held coins of light instead of leaves, her pocket watch ticking in contented recognition. "Moments that almost happened," she whispered, understanding that this place held not regret, but the gentle truth that every path not taken still existed somewhere in the soft parallel spaces of the heart. Mira watched with quiet awe as Luna reached toward a flower blooming with petals like captured starlight. The moment those tiny fingers touched its surface, the entire garden exhaled in harmony, releasing a fragrance that smelled like hope given form, like love learning to grow in the spaces where logic ended and wonder began. Here, in this place where nothing was truly lost, but only held in a different kind of memory, they discovered that reality itself was far softer, far more expansive than they had ever imagined. A gentle, interwoven dance of what was, what could have been, and what, in some quiet corner of existence, still bloomed eternal. As the garden's gentle exhale settled around them like a blessing that chose not to end, a figure appeared on the winding path, with the unhurried grace of someone who had been expected long before she arrived. She moved through the dappled light as if the very air had been waiting to part for her passage, her silver hair catching the golden hour's last rays, and her arms cradling a basket that seemed to hold captured starlight within its woven depths. "I wondered when you would find your way here," the woman said, her voice carrying the warmth of recognition, despite none of them having seen her before. In Willowmere, such meetings had become as natural as breathing. "I am Iris, and I have been waiting quite some time to meet the child who teaches moments how to hold more gentleness." Luna's humming began immediately, rising to meet Iris's presence like a melody finding its harmony. The woman approached with steps that seemed to leave traces of warmth on the garden path, and when she knelt beside Luna's shawl-wrapped form, the air shimmered with the particular magic that happens when two kinds of ancient wisdom recognize each other. From her impossible basket, Iris drew forth what appeared to be threads of living light, some silver as captured moonbeams, others gold as distilled sunshine, still others in colors that existed only in the spaces between one heartbeat and the next. They moved in her hands like gentle creatures, weaving patterns in the air that spoke of connection, of healing, of the invisible bonds that link every soul to every other across the vast tapestry of existence. "These are spun from the moments when people choose kindness over convenience," Iris explained, her fingers working the luminous threads with practiced reverence. "From the instant when strangers become friends, when forgiveness blooms where resentment once grew, when someone decides to listen with their whole heart, instead of simply waiting for their turn to speak." Ezra stepped forward, understanding intuitively, and released the pause before saying yes from one of his carefully labeled jars. The silence drifted through Iris's working hands, and suddenly the threads began to weave themselves, creating spaces where healing could happen without force or hurry. Sage's pocket watch ticked its gentle rhythm, and the weaving found that cadence, each thread settling into place with the patience of something that knew its proper time. "She doesn't create peaceful moments," Iris said, her eyes bright with understanding, as she watched Luna's tiny fingers reach toward the forming tapestry. "She helps people see the golden threads that were always there, connecting their scattered experiences into something beautiful. But this gift needs to be nurtured, taught how to grow without overwhelming the small heart that carries it." As the last light of day painted the garden in shades of amber and rose, Iris began the first lesson in a craft that had no name, but whose purpose was as old as human kindness itself. Not to change what had been, but to help people recognize the patterns their lives were creating. The beauty that emerged when individual threads of joy and sorrow were viewed as part of a larger, more magnificent design, the evening air filled with the soft music of learning, as three children and one ancient weaver began the patient work of discovering how to help the world remember its own capacity for healing, one gentle thread at a time. The threads of starlight that Iris had taught them to weave seemed to pulse with anticipation as autumn settled over Willowmere like a gentle benediction. Luna, now able to sit upright in her basket and reach toward the golden patterns that danced perpetually through the air around her, had begun to understand that her humming could do more than create peace. It could help people recognize the connections between their scattered moments of joy and sorrow, weaving them into something beautiful and whole. It was Mrs. Chen who first brought word of the extraordinary gatherings that had begun appearing in the town square. She arrived at the library with her usual offering of warm bread and eyes bright with barely contained wonder, settling beside Luna's basket, where the baby was contemplating a particularly intricate pattern of light that seemed to spell stories in languages older than words. "Once a month, when the moon grows full," Mrs. Chen whispered, her voice carrying the reverent tone reserved for miracles, "people gather in the square with bundles wrapped in dark cloth. They bring their nightmares, their recurring worries, their dreams that have grown too heavy to carry alone." She paused, searching for words adequate to such strangeness. "And somehow they leave with different dreams entirely, ones that help them sleep with the peace of children who have never known fear." That evening, as the full moon rose like a pearl against velvet sky, Mira wrapped Luna in the blue shawl that had become their traveling cocoon. Ezra joined them, his satchel of collected silences creating pockets of profound quiet around their small procession, while Sage's pocket watch ticked in harmony with footsteps that seemed to move in rhythm with something much larger than themselves. The town square had transformed into something from a fairy tale written in silver ink and starlight. Blankets spread across the cobblestones created intimate circles where people sat with their wrapped bundles, speaking in voices soft as prayer. Lanterns hung from invisible threads, casting light that seemed to understand the sacred nature of what was unfolding. The very air shimmered with possibility, and Luna's humming began immediately, rising to meet the gentle magic that had claimed this familiar space. At the center of it all stood a figure whose presence made the evening itself seem to lean closer in attention. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to weave dreams as easily as others braided rope, her hands accepting each offered burden with reverent care. Around her, people approached with their bundled fears and departed with packages that seemed to glow from within, their faces transformed by the particular peace that comes from discovering that even nightmares can become something healing. Luna watched as a young woman unwrapped what appeared to be crystallized anxiety, its faceted surface reflecting sleepless nights and racing thoughts. The Dreamkeeper accepted it with gentle hands, then selected from her own collection something that pulsed with soft blue light. "Peaceful sleep," she murmured, "woven from the dreams of children and strengthened with the rest of grandmothers who sleep." With complete trust in tomorrow's kindness, Ezra released the breath before saying goodnight from one of his carefully labeled jars, and the silence drifted through the exchange like a blessing. Sage's pocket watch ticked its gentle rhythm, helping the new dream find its proper cadence within the woman's heart. Luna's humming deepened, and suddenly everyone present could feel the golden threads connecting them, each person's released burden becoming another's pathway to healing, each shared dream strengthening the invisible tapestry that held their community together. As the market continued its gentle work through the soft hours of night, Luna began to understand that her gift wasn't about creating magic, but about helping people recognize the magic that had always existed in the spaces between one heart and another, where healing happened not through force but through the patient, loving recognition that no one need carry their burdens alone. The gentle magic of the dream market had woven itself into Willowmere's daily rhythm like a new melody learned by heart, and in the days that followed, people moved through their morning routines with the particular lightness that comes from sleeping deeply and dreaming well. Luna, now able to sit steadily and reach with growing curiosity toward the golden threads that danced perpetually around her, had begun to understand that her humming could help people see connections they hadn't noticed before, the invisible pathways that linked one moment of peace to another, one heart to the healing it sought. It was during one of these peaceful mornings, as autumn painted the library windows with amber light, and the emotional whispers from the books seemed particularly clear and welcoming, that a new visitor arrived carrying the scent of aged parchment and the particular stillness that belongs to those who spend their days charting invisible territories. He appeared at the library's threshold like a gentle question mark, his silver hair catching the golden light, and his arms cradling a leather portfolio that seemed to hold more than paper. "I am Henrik," he said, though everyone knew Henrik the clockmaker. "But I am Henrik the mapmaker, and I draw charts of places that exist only in feeling." His voice carried the warm authority of someone who had spent decades learning to navigate the landscapes of the human heart. "I've heard about the child who helps moments hold more gentleness, and I believe she might understand the territories I explore." Mira felt that familiar stirring of recognition, the gentle compass that had been guiding her since Luna's arrival, pointing toward encounters that would prove essential in ways not yet understood. She gathered Luna in the soft blue shawl, while Ezra appeared with his satchel of collected silences, and Sage arrived with her pocket watch, ticking its steady rhythm of patient time. The mapmaker led them through winding streets to a small workshop tucked behind the mill, where the sound of flowing water provided a constant, soothing backdrop. The space felt like a sanctuary for invisible things, shelves lined with rolled charts, tied with ribbons the color of distant memories, and a large table where current work spread like captured starlight across aged vellum. "Most maps show you how to get from one place to another," Henrik explained, unrolling a chart that defied every convention of geography. Instead of roads and rivers, it displayed the winding paths that lead from loneliness to belonging, marked with symbols that represented feelings rather than landmarks. The crossroads where grief meets acceptance, The gentle valleys where exhausted hearts learn to rest, the bridges that span the distance between fear and trust. Luna's humming began the moment she saw the map, rising to meet something she recognized in its careful lines and patient symbols. As her voice wove through the air, the most extraordinary thing happened. New pathways began to appear, drawn in threads of silver light that connected territories that had seemed forever separate. A bridge materialized between the lands of anger and understanding, while gentle streams began to flow from the mountains of sorrow toward meadows where healing grew wild and unstructured. Ezra stepped forward with reverent understanding, releasing the pause before forgiveness from one of his carefully labeled jars. The silence settled over the map like morning mist, and suddenly everyone present could see not just the pathways, but the travelers who walked them, invisible pilgrims making their way from one emotional territory to another, guided by nothing more than hope and the patient belief that somewhere ahead lay the country where their hearts could finally rest. Sage's pocket watch began to tick in harmony with something deeper than seconds, the rhythm of emotional seasons, the cadence of hearts learning to heal in their own time. Under its gentle influence, the map revealed temporal dimensions, rest stops for those who needed to pause before continuing, seasonal routes that opened only when the heart was ready, safe harbors where the storm-tossed could wait for calmer weather. "She doesn't change the geography of feelings," Henrik whispered, his eyes bright with understanding, as he watched Luna's influence transform his careful cartography into something alive and responsive. "She helps people see that there are always multiple paths, that no one is ever truly lost, and that even the most difficult territories eventually lead somewhere beautiful, if you're willing to keep walking with patience and trust." As the afternoon light deepened to gold, Luna reached her small hand toward a particular section of the map, a vast, shimmering expanse marked simply as home. Under her touch, pathways from every other territory began to converge there, showing that no matter where the journey began, no matter how far the heart had wandered, there was always a way back to the place where peace lived, where love waited with infinite patience, where every weary traveler could finally rest. The convergence of pathways toward home on Henrik's map seemed to pulse with gentle warmth as they made their way back through Willowmere's evening-touched streets. Luna, cradled in her blue shawl and humming a melody that harmonized with the distant sounds of daily life settling into its quieter rhythms. The amber light of approaching dusk painted the cobblestones with gold, and somewhere in the comfortable percussion of doors opening and closing throughout the town, something had shifted into a more musical cadence. It was Sage who first noticed the change, her head tilting with the same careful attention she brought to her father's clockwork. "Listen," she whispered, her pocket watch ticking its steady rhythm against the evening air. "They're not just opening and closing anymore, they're trying to say something." As if responding to this recognition, Luna's humming took on what could only be described as a conversational tone, rising and falling in gentle response to sounds that seemed ordinary, but carried underneath them a current of patient communication. The oak doors of the library murmured, with the contentment of stories well tended, while Mrs. Chen's bakery door sighed with the satisfaction of mornings that began with warm bread and ended with empty shelves, each loaf a small gift of nourishment to the community it served. Mira felt the familiar stirring of wonder as they paused beside a cottage whose green-painted door seemed to hold itself with particular dignity. Unlike the welcoming whisper of other thresholds, this one spoke in the quiet language of boundaries, not rejection but protection, the gentle but firm voice of something that understood its sacred duty to guard what lay beyond. "It's holding a secret," Ezra said softly. Approaching with the reverent attention he brought to his collection of silences. From his satchel, he drew a jar labeled "The Pause Before Knocking" and released its contents into the evening air. The silence that emerged seemed to acknowledge the door's guardianship, creating a respectful space around its threshold that honored its need to remain closed. Luna's humming shifted then, becoming less of a question and more of a gentle acknowledgement. Her small hand reached toward the painted wood, but stopped just short of touching. And in that moment of restraint, Mira understood that her daughter was learning one of life's most important lessons, that true gentleness sometimes meant knowing when not to enter, when to honor the spaces that needed to remain undisturbed. Some doors protect rather than exclude, Sage observed, her pocket watch ticking in rhythm with something deeper than seconds, the patient cadence of boundaries maintained with love rather than fear. They're not keeping people out. They're keeping something precious safe. As they continued their walk, Luna's gift began to work its subtle magic throughout the neighborhood. Her humming seemed to help each door remember its true purpose, translating between the language of thresholds and the hearts of those who approached them. The sharp edges of rejection softened into gentle guidance, while doors that had forgotten how to welcome began to remember the joy of opening at exactly the right moment. They passed the cottage where Mrs. Hartwell had been living in increasing isolation, her blue door adorned with dried flowers, but close to the community that longed to offer assistance. As Luna's melody reached its threshold, something profound shifted. The door's whisper changed from defensive solitude to lonely hope. And within moments, Mrs. Hartwell herself appeared, opening wide to the evening air and calling out to ask if anyone might join her for tea, and the apple cake that was far too large for one person to finish alone. The transformation was immediate and beautiful, neighbors emerging from their own doorways, with smiles and gentle offers of companionship, the evening air filling with the warmth of connection freely given and gratefully received. Luna's humming deepened with satisfaction, weaving golden threads between hearts that had been separated not by lack of caring, but by the simple difficulty of knowing how to reach across the space between wanting to help and asking for it. At the town square's edge, they encountered a door that practically vibrated with eagerness, the entrance to Sage's family cafe, its threshold singing with anticipation of morning customers who would arrive carrying the weight of difficult nights and leave with cups full of hope, brewed strong and served with infinite patience. Ezra released the breath before beginning again from one of his carefully labeled jars, and the cafe door seemed to exhale with gratitude, its handle warming with the promise of second chances served daily alongside fresh coffee and understanding. By the time the first stars appeared overhead, Luna had helped every door in their neighborhood remember the nuanced language of welcome and boundary, teaching them how to say not now with kindness instead of rejection, how to express yes please without desperation, how to communicate I need space without building walls that could never again be crossed. The very air seemed lighter, filled with the possibility of connection that honored both the need for solitude and the equally sacred need for communion. As they reached their own cottage, Luna's gentle humming continued to weave through the familiar threshold, teaching even these most intimate doors how to hold space for vulnerability without exposure, privacy without loneliness, the delicate balance between opening and closing that transforms a house into a true home. In the growing darkness, Willowmere settled into sleep with the profound peace that comes from knowing that every threshold in their community now spoke the language of love, sometimes as welcome, sometimes as protection, but always as a recognition that the spaces between hearts require the most careful and gentle tending of all. The morning after the neighborhood's doors had learned to speak in the language of love, the scent of possibility seemed to drift through Willowmere's streets like invisible threads connecting heart to heart. Luna, now able to sit steadily in her basket and babble responses to conversations happening in frequencies beyond ordinary hearing, had begun to reach toward patterns of light that spelled nourishment in alphabets older than hunger itself. Her gentle humming carried a new quality, deeper, more purposeful, as if she were learning to weave healing into the very air people breathed. It was the warmth emanating from Sage's family cafe that drew them naturally toward the town square, where golden light spilled through windows that seemed to glow from within. The building itself appeared to pulse with gentle anticipation, its threshold singing with the particular joy of a place that had remembered its true calling. As they approached, Luna's humming began immediately, rising to meet something she recognized in the careful choreography of morning rituals and the sacred act of nourishing both body and soul. Inside, Sage's mother Elena moved behind the counter with a grace that seemed newly discovered. Her usual efficient bustle transformed into something approaching dance. The espresso machine hummed in harmony with Luna's melody, and the very air shimmered with threads of silver and gold that spoke of comfort being brewed into every cup, patience being stirred into every pot of tea. "The beans whispered to me this morning," Eleanor explained, her voice carrying the wonder of someone who had learned to listen to impossible things. They wanted to carry more than caffeine. They wanted to brew second chances, to steep hope strong enough to last through difficult afternoons. Ezra approached the counter with reverent understanding, releasing the pause before asking for help from one of his carefully labeled jars. The silence that emerged seemed to acknowledge the profound vulnerability required to accept nourishment from another's hands. And suddenly the entire cafe exhaled, with the recognition that true hospitality was less about service and more about creating sacred space for healing to unfold naturally. A young teacher entered, her shoulders carrying the weight of classrooms full of restless energy and her own uncertainty about whether she was strong enough for the work she had chosen. Sage measured beans that smelled like rain on summer afternoons and added cardamom for steadiness, while Luna's humming wove through the steam rising from the cup. When the warm ceramic touched the teacher's hands, something shifted in her posture, a softening, a recognition that perhaps her struggles were not failures, but simply the growing pains of learning to love work that mattered. "Maybe I'll start by listening," she murmured, surprised at her own words, and Elena nodded with the understanding of someone who knew that the most important recipes could not be measured in teaspoons, but required generous portions of patience, forgiveness and faith in the possibility that tomorrow might unfold more gently than today. As the morning progressed, the cafe revealed its transformation completely. An elderly man found that his coffee somehow made reading difficult news feel less overwhelming, while a teenager discovered that hot chocolate could taste like courage when served with genuine attention to the heart that needed strengthening. Each interaction became a small ceremony of care, demonstrating that nourishment came in countless forms and that sometimes the most profound healing happened in the quiet spaces between sips and the gentle ooh. Recognition that no one need face their hungers, physical, emotional, or spiritual, entirely alone. Outside, someone was approaching with soil under her fingernails and the particular peace that belongs to those who tend growing things, carrying news of vegetables that had learned to comfort and flowers that bloomed in colors, designed to heal specific varieties of heartache. Luna's humming deepened with anticipation, sensing that the circle of gentle nourishment was about to expand in ways that would teach the entire town new languages of love. The woman who entered the cafe carried autumn on her fingertips and the quiet satisfaction that comes from coaxing life from soil with patient devotion. Maya moved through the doorway with hands still dusted with earth, her canvas bag releasing the scents of fresh herbs and root vegetables that seemed to pulse with their own gentle warmth. She approached Luna's basket with the reverent attention of someone who understood that all growing things shared a common language of nurturing and care. "The pumpkins whispered to me this morning," Maya said, her voice carrying the wonder of someone who had learned to translate between the needs of soil and soul. "They said it's time to gather the lights." From her bag, she withdrew vegetables that seemed to glow with inner luminescence, carrots that pulsed with golden comfort, herbs that shimmered with the silver green of renewal, squash that held the warm contentment of harvest gratitude. Luna's humming began immediately, weaving through the scents of fresh earth and growing things with a melody that spoke of cycles completing themselves. As her voice rose to meet Maya's gentle presence, something extraordinary began to unfold throughout the cafe. The vegetables in Maya's bag began to emit a soft glow, each one radiating the particular healing it offered: tomatoes pulsing with courage for anxious hearts, leafy greens whispering renewal for weary spirits. Elena moved behind the counter with newfound purpose, understanding intuitively that this was about more than food. Together, she and Maya began preparing nourishment that would carry comfort in forms that could be tasted, shared, prepared with love and served with the recognition that everyone deserved to be fed not just in body, but in heart and hope. As word of the Festival of Gentle Light spread through Willowmere's network of kitchen conversations and Garden Gate confidences, the afternoon light began its shift toward the particular gold that speaks of celebration. By evening, the town square had transformed into something approaching a dream, where ordinary space had learned to hold extraordinary possibilities. People arrived carrying their individual offerings of light, children with fireflies cupped gently in their palms, adults with lanterns crafted from gourds and paper, elderly residents with candles, whose flames danced with the fragile beauty of wishes made in quiet moments. Each person moved with the hushed reverence of someone participating in something sacred, understanding without explanation that tonight was about more than tradition. Luna, settled in her basket at the heart of the gathering, began her humming with a melody that seemed to coax light from every source. As her voice wove through the deepening twilight, the most extraordinary thing happened. Each individual light began to connect to every other, forming an intricate, luminous web that stretched across the square and up toward the first stars. Ezra stepped forward with reverent understanding, releasing the pause before hope from one of his carefully labeled jars. The silence that emerged created space for each person to feel the profound connection blooming between their small light and the collective radiance. Sage's pocket watch ticked its steady rhythm, helping each flicker find its perfect timing within the greater design. As the constellation of lights grew, something beautiful became clear. The trembling candle of someone who had recently known loss found strength in the steady glow of a family's lantern, while a child's firefly seemed to lend courage to an elderly woman's flickering flame. It was not about individual brightness, but about the undeniable truth that when light was gently gathered, it became something infinitely greater than its parts. The air filled with profound and comforting quiet. People stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces illuminated by soft reflected glow, their hearts connected by invisible threads of shared presence. Luna's humming deepened into a lullaby for the entire town, weaving a tapestry of peace that promised to hold them through whatever seasons lay ahead, reminding them that even in darkness, light could always be found when, patiently nurtured and generously shared, the constellation of lights that had woven itself across Willowmere's town square the night before seemed to have left, invisible threads throughout the town, connecting heart to heart in ways that became apparent only in the gentle morning light. Luna, settled in her familiar basket at the library, began her humming with a melody that seemed to reach toward something that needed careful tending. Not the grand healing of community celebration, but the intimate work of mending what had been quietly broken by time and loving use. Mira discovered them scattered across the returns desk like fallen leaves, books whose spines had separated from their covers, pages that had come loose from their moorings, volumes whose bindings bore the gentle scars of having been treasured beyond their physical capacity to endure. Each one whispered its own story of damage, not neglect but the opposite, the beautiful wear that comes from being loved too well, held too often, carried too far in pockets and hearts that refuse to let them go. Today we learn that mending is sacred work, Mira murmured, gathering the wounded volumes with reverent hands. Luna's humming deepened in response, weaving through the morning air with threads of silver and gold that seemed to connect each torn page to its longing for wholeness. She cleared the long wooden table, near the windows where light fell with particular gentleness, laying out tools that had been waiting for this moment. Bone folders softened by years of patient use, linen threads strong enough to hold stories together, paste that smelled like wheat fields and summer kitchens. As she worked, Ezra appeared with his satchel, releasing the breath before gentle work into the air, creating space where healing could unfold without hurry. The first book to receive attention was Mrs. Hartwell's cookbook, its spine cracked precisely where generations of hands had turned to the same beloved recipe. Mira aligned the separated pieces with movements that felt like prayer, understanding that this was not about hiding the evidence of love, but honoring it. As she brushed paste into the hidden places where threads had loosened, Luna's humming shifted into something that sounded remarkably like a lullaby for kitchens, and the room filled with the phantom scent of cinnamon and welcome. Sage joined them, her pocket watch ticking its steady rhythm, helping each repair find its proper timing. Together, they learned that some tears needed to be sewn with deliberately visible thread, creating beautiful scars that honored the book's journey through difficulty. Others required nearly invisible mending that preserved the illusion of wholeness while strengthening the places where vulnerability had been discovered. A young teacher arrived carrying a slim volume of poetry, its margins crowded with her grandmother's careful notes. "The binding is failing," she said softly, "but I can't bear to lose her handwriting." Under Luna's gentle influence, they discovered that the most important repairs were those that preserved not just the story, but the evidence of all the hearts that had found solace within its pages. As afternoon light deepened to amber, word had spread through Willowmere's network of kitchen conversations and garden gate confidences. People began arriving with their own broken treasures, photo albums, journals, family Bibles bearing the loving damage of faithful hands. Each person approached with the vulnerable hope of someone who understood that some things were too precious to discard, even when they seemed beyond saving. By evening, the library had transformed into a sanctuary for the carefully broken and the patiently mended, where the work of restoration was recognized as love's highest expression, the willingness to sit with damage without despair, to honor scars as evidence of having been worth saving, to understand that the most beautiful stories often carried within them visible proof of having chosen, again and again, to continue. Outside, the sound of approaching footsteps carried a rhythm that seemed to harmonize with Luna's continuing melody, suggesting that their circle of gentle healing was about to expand once more. The footsteps that approached carried the particular rhythm of those who had learned to make music from the simple act of moving through the world together. When the library doors opened, they revealed a small group of travelers whose instruments seemed to catch and hold the same gentle light that had begun appearing wherever Luna's influence touched Willowmere. The leader, a woman whose violin case bore the loving scars of countless journeys, paused at the threshold with the reverent attention of someone who recognized sacred space when she encountered it. "We are traveling musicians," she said, her voice carrying harmonies that seemed to linger in the air like visible threads. "And we play melodies that help people remember forgotten joys." Behind her, 3 companions carried instruments that seemed to glow with their own inner warmth. A flute carved from what appeared to be crystallized laughter, a drum whose surface reflected not light but memories, hand strings that hummed with the contentment of lullabies sung in languages that had never needed words. Luna's response was immediate and profound. Her gentle humming began to weave through the air, finding harmonies with the musicians' presence before they had even unpacked their instruments. As her melody rose to meet their unspoken songs, the library filled with something that transcended ordinary music, a resonance that seemed to awaken sleeping memories in everyone present, reminding them of moments when joy had surprised them with its simple, unexpected presence. The violin emerged first, its voice joining Luna's humming, with the delicate precision of raindrops finding their rhythm on summer leaves. As the melody developed, people throughout the library began to remember things they hadn't thought of in years: the particular quality of light on a childhood afternoon, the feeling of being understood without explanation, the taste of ice cream shared with someone who had since become a treasured memory. Ezra stepped forward with understanding that seemed to flow from the music itself, releasing the pause before remembering from one of his carefully labeled jars. The silence that emerged created space for each person's awakened memories to unfold, without overwhelming the heart that carried them. Sage's pocket watch began to tick in harmony with the gentle drum, helping each recollection find its proper place within the larger symphony of shared experience. Mrs. Hartwell, who had brought her cookbook to be repaired, found herself remembering not just recipes, but the laughter that had filled her kitchen when her children were small. The young teacher discovered that her grandmother's voice, which she thought she had forgotten, was still there in the spaces between the notes, offering encouragement for the difficult days ahead. As the music continued, something extraordinary unfolded. The musicians' melodies seemed to create pockets of time where people could revisit difficult memories with the wisdom they had gained since, where old wounds could be seen from the perspective of all the growth that had followed. Each person's individual story began to harmonize with every other, creating a symphony of human experience that acknowledged pain without being overwhelmed by it, celebrated joy without ignoring complexity. As the last notes faded into the library's gentle quiet, Luna's humming continued like an echo that promised to carry their rediscovered joys forward into whatever tomorrow might bring, teaching everyone present that sometimes the most powerful healing came not from fixing what was broken, but from remembering what had always been beautifully, perfectly whole. The harmonies left by the traveling musicians seemed to have woven themselves into the very air of the library, creating an atmosphere where even silence carried melody. Luna, settled in her basket among the emotional whispers of countless stories, began her humming with a new quality, deeper, more purposeful. as if she were calling to something that hadn't yet arrived, but was already needed. It was during this resonant afternoon that a young man appeared in the doorway, moving with the careful attention of someone who had learned to see beyond surfaces. He carried an easel under one arm and a canvas bag that seemed to shimmer with colors that existed only in the spaces between what was observed and what was truly witnessed. His presence felt like a gentle question mark, as if he were asking permission not just to enter, but to see. "I'm Rowan," he said, his voice soft as brushed velvet. "And I paint not how people look, but how they feel when they're truly seen." His eyes found Luna's with immediate recognition, and her humming rose to meet his presence like a melody, finding its perfect harmony. As Rowan set up his easel near the window where light fell with unusual warmth, Luna's influence began to work its subtle magic. The air around them seemed to deepen and glow, and everyone present felt the particular vulnerability that comes with being witnessed rather than merely observed. Ezra stepped forward with understanding, releasing the pause before being seen from one of his carefully labeled jars, creating sacred space where recognition could unfold without the usual defenses. Rowan began with Mrs. Chen, who had arrived with fresh bread and cheeks still flushed from the morning's baking. As his brush moved across the canvas, something extraordinary happened. The lines that emerged didn't capture her physical features, but revealed something far more profound: the quiet strength that had carried her through decades of early mornings, the deep well of nurturing that infused every loaf she made, the profound satisfaction of a life spent feeding both body and soul. Sage's pocket watch ticked its gentle rhythm, helping the colors find their emotional cadence, while Luna's humming wove through each brushstroke like a lullaby for the heart being portrayed. What emerged wasn't a traditional portrait, but a luminous map of Mrs. Chen's inner landscape, painted in hues that sang with gentle resilience and understated joy. When Mrs. Chen saw herself reflected not in mirror accuracy, but in the truth of her generous spirit, tears welled in her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the profound relief of being witnessed in all her beautiful essential truth. "I had forgotten," she whispered, "that this is who I am beneath all the worry." As word spread through Willomere's network of gentle conversations, people began arriving with the vulnerable hope of those who had lost sight of their own magnificence. Each portrait session became a ceremony of recognition, with Luna's humming creating space where people could see themselves through eyes that looked past every surface imperfection to the irreplaceable light that lived at their core. By evening, the library had transformed into a gallery of human essence, where every painting served as evidence that beneath daily struggles and accumulated insecurities, each person carried something absolutely magnificent, not perfection, but the particular beauty that could only exist when someone was courageously, completely themselves. Outside, the gentle sounds of evening settling over Willowmere promised that tomorrow would bring new opportunities for such profound seeing, such healing recognition of the light that lived in every heart, brave enough to be witnessed. The portraits that lined the library walls seemed to pulse with their own gentle light as the days following Rowan's revelations settled into Willowmere's rhythm like new threads in an ancient tapestry. Luna, now able to pull herself upright in her basket and babble responses to conversations happening in frequencies beyond ordinary hearing, had begun reaching towards something that carried the weight of accumulated years, not burden, but the profound responsibility that comes with being trusted to hold what others can no longer carry alone. It was Mrs. Hartwell who brought this new understanding, arriving at the library with her usual basket of fresh scones, but moving with the careful attention of someone navigating a familiar room that had somehow rearranged itself overnight. Her eyes found the repaired cookbook on Mira's desk, with visible relief, then drifted toward the portraits with a puzzled expression that carried both wonder and gentle confusion. "These faces," she said softly, approaching Rowan's paintings with the reverent attention she usually reserved for prayer, "they look like people I should remember, but their names keep stepping away just as I reach for them." She laughed with the particular courage of someone who had learned to find humor in life's unexpected challenges. "It's as if my memories have become shy birds, landing close enough to see but flying away when I try to hold them." Luna's response was immediate and profound. Her humming began with a melody that seemed to gather rather than awaken, weaving itself around the edges of Mrs. Hartwell's scattered recollections, like golden thread designed to hold precious things without constraining them. As her voice filled the library's gentle quiet, something extraordinary occurred. The portraits began to glow with unusual warmth, and Mrs. Hartwell's expression shifted from confusion to recognition, not of specific details, but of the deeper truth that lived beneath memory's surface. Mira approached with understanding that flowed from Luna's continuing song, recognizing that this moment required not solutions but sanctuary. Ezra stepped forward, releasing the pause between remembering and letting go from one of his carefully labeled jars, creating space where memory could exist without the pressure to perform perfectly. Sage's pocket watch began to tick with the rhythm of seasons rather than seconds, helping each fragmented recollection find its natural place within the larger story of a life well lived. Iris appeared as she often did when delicate work required the gentlest hands, carrying threads spun from starlight and the particular wisdom that comes from understanding how to weave beauty from what seems broken. "Some memories are meant to be held collectively," she said, drawing forth a strand of gold so fine it seemed made of crystallized sunlight. "Not because they're lost, but because they're too precious for one heart to carry alone. Together, they created something unprecedented, a living archive where Mrs. Hartwell's stories could rest safely even when her mind grew tired of holding them." Rowan painted not her fading recollections, but the emotional landscapes they had created, while Mira wrote gentle reminders on cards that smelled like lavender and understanding. Each object, each image, each carefully chosen word became an anchor point where memory could land when it grew weary of wandering. As afternoon light deepened to amber, Mrs. Hartwell settled into the reading chair with the profound peace of someone who had discovered that forgetting didn't mean losing, that some treasures became more beautiful when shared rather than hoarded. Luna's golden thread, now woven through every anchor they had created, pulsed with gentle warmth, a visible reminder that no story truly ends, but simply finds new ways to continue blessing the world through the hearts that choose to remember with love rather than desperation. Outside, the sound of evening settling over Willowmere carried the promise that tomorrow would bring new opportunities for such sacred work, such patient tending of the invisible, bonds that connect every heart to the larger, story of which it forms an irreplaceable part at the golden threads woven through Mrs. Hartwell's. Memory archives seemed to shimmer with unusual intensity as evening settled over the library, but it was Luna's humming that first announced the approaching transformation. Her melody had shifted into something deeper, more watchful, as if she were listening to a conversation happening just beyond the edge of hearing. The baby, now able to pull herself upright and take tentative steps between the reading chairs, moved with the careful attention of someone following an invisible thread towards something wonderful and necessary. Mira felt the change before she saw it, a subtle shift in the air pressure that made her pause in her cataloguing work and look toward the tall windows where afternoon light had begun to take on an unusual quality. Not the harsh brightness that speaks of violence, but a soft pearl-gray luminescence that seemed to wrap itself around Willowmere like a gentle embrace, preparing the town for something it didn't yet know it needed. The first drops began to fall as they were gathering their things, each one landing with the soft percussion of a lullaby being tapped out on willing earth. But this rain carried something more than moisture. It seemed to bring with it the very essence of rest, the kind of deep, cellular peace that allows healing to happen at levels usually beyond conscious awareness. Luna's response was immediate and profound. Her humming shifted into perfect harmony with the rain's gentle rhythm, and suddenly the approaching weather revealed its true nature, not disruption but invitation, a 3-day cocoon of quiet that would settle over Willowmere like a blessing the town hadn't known it was waiting for. As they walked home through the increasingly gentle downpour, Luna cradled in her blue shawl and babbling responses to the rain's whispered conversations. The very air seemed to exhale with relief. Through windows that had begun to glow earlier than usual, Mira could see neighbors moving with the unhurried grace of those who had been given permission to exist at a more natural pace. The storm was teaching the entire community to breathe more slowly. By morning of the second day, the rain had woven itself so completely into Willowmere's rhythm that the library became something approaching a sanctuary. Candlelight replaced electric bulbs with warm, flickering illumination that seemed to understand the assignment of creating sacred space. The emotional whispers from the books settled into lower registers, like a chorus leaning into harmony, while people arrived in quiet pairs and small clusters, shaking rain from coats and gathering at tables that had somehow learned to listen. Ezra appeared with his satchel of collected silences, his eyes bright with wonder at what the storm had revealed. "The rain is collecting its own quiet," he whispered, releasing the pause between raindrops into the storm-softened air. The silence that emerged seemed to merge seamlessly with the gentle percussion on the roof, creating pockets of profound stillness where conversations could unfold with unusual depth and children could discover the satisfaction of games that required imagination rather than noise. Elena arrived from the cafe with a kettle that sang even without electricity, and mugs circled the room carrying warmth and the promise that no one need hurry through this gift of enforced gentleness. Sage's pocket watch ticked in easy agreement with the steady rhythm overhead, while Rowan found himself painting with rainwater, his portraits dissolving at the edges in ways that felt exactly right, as if the storm itself insisted that boundaries deserved softness. As the second day deepened into evening, Luna's influence worked its subtle magic throughout the community. Her humming helped people recognize that this wasn't interruption, but opportunity. Time when the world had conspired to slow down enough for deeper healing to unfold. Neighbors who had been too busy for meaningful conversation found themselves sharing tea and stories that mattered. Adults remembered what it felt like to move through their days without the constant pressure of urgency. On the third morning, as gutters sang and the world smelled like renewal, something extraordinary had occurred throughout Willowmere. The rain had taught even restless thoughts to sit by the window, and people spoke not of plans but of textures, how memory felt smoother when heard against a backdrop of water, how hope crept back like steam along the rim of a warm cup. As the storm began its gentle departure, painting wet streets with tentative gold, Luna's humming carried a note of profound satisfaction, the sound of someone who had helped an entire town remember that sometimes the most powerful healing happens not through action, but through the simple, sacred act of allowing the world to slow down enough for peace to take root and flourish. The air itself felt cleaner, charged with the particular clarity that comes after listening well, and every heart in Willowmere carried the quiet certainty that they had been given something precious, the knowledge that rest was not luxury but necessity, that gentleness was not weakness but wisdom, and that sometimes the most profound transformations arrived not with fanfare but with the patient percussion of rain on willing earth. Outside, the first bird began to sing, and Luna's humming rose to meet its melody, weaving together the end of one blessing and the beginning of whatever gentle miracle would unfold next in their corner of the world where wonder had learned to wear the comfortable clothes of daily life. The profound quiet left by the 3-day storm seemed to have washed more than dust from Willowmere's streets. It had cleansed the very air of hurry, leaving behind a crystalline clarity that made even thoughts move more slowly, more purposefully. Luna, now taking her first determined steps between the library's reading chairs, moved with the careful attention of someone following invisible threads toward something the town didn't yet know it needed. Her humming had shifted since the rain, carrying within its gentle melody the particular resonance that comes when healing has created space for deeper truths to surface. It was Mrs. Hartwell who first gave voice to what the storm had stirred in many hearts. She sat by the window, where afternoon light painted golden rectangles across worn wooden floors, a half-written letter trembling in her weathered hands like a captured bird, unsure whether it wanted to be released. The emotional whispers from the surrounding books seemed to lean closer, as if recognizing the weight of words that had been carried in silence for far too long. "So many things I never said," she murmured, not to anyone in particular, but to the gentle light that seemed to understand the burden of unexpressed love. Words that needed speaking, but the moment passed or the person passed and they just stay, don't they? Heavy in the heart, growing heavier with each season. Luna's response was immediate and profound. Her humming deepened into a melody that seemed designed specifically to hold space for such sacred weight, weaving through the library's afternoon quiet with threads of silver and gold that spoke of release without abandonment, expression without the need for response. As her voice filled the air, everyone present felt something shift, not the pressure to fix what couldn't be mended, but permission to honor what had never been spoken. Mira approached with the understanding that had been guiding her since Luna's arrival, recognizing in this moment the gentle compass pointing toward exactly what their community needed next. Ezra appeared with his satchel, releasing the pause before confession into the air, creating sacred space where vulnerability could unfold without judgment. Sage's pocket watch began to tick with the rhythm of patient time, helping unspoken words find their proper cadence within the larger symphony of human longing. What if there was a place for those words? Mira suggested, her voice soft as falling dust motes. A sanctuary where they could still be spoken, even when they can't reach their intended recipient. The idea bloomed between them like a flower opening to morning light, and within hours they had created something unprecedented. Not a grand structure, but a humble mailbox crafted from wood that seemed to hold starlight in its grain, painted the color of twilight and adorned with a single carved feather that spoke of words released to whatever. Gentle winds might carry them where they needed to go. They placed it in the town square beneath the ancient oak that had witnessed generations of Willowmere's joys and sorrows, where morning light would bless it first and evening shadows would offer protection. The inscription appeared as if written by the wood itself, for words that need to exist in the world. The first letter arrived before they had even announced the tradition's existence. Mrs. Hartwell approached with movements that spoke of profound relief, carrying an envelope addressed "To the husband who taught me that love lives in quiet moments." As she slipped it through the slot, something beautiful occurred. The mailbox seemed to exhale with gratitude, and her shoulders dropped, as if invisible weight had finally been set down with reverent care. Throughout the afternoon, people arrived with their own carefully crafted offerings. A young teacher brought words meant for the student she couldn't save, while Eleanor from the cafe deposited gratitude intended for her grandmother's hands that had taught her to bake love into every loaf. Henrik the mapmaker offered directions to forgiveness he had never learned to navigate, and even Thomas the postman contributed a letter to the version of himself who had been too afraid to take chances on joy. Luna's continuing humming wove through each deposit like golden thread, connecting every unexpressed message to the larger tapestry of human experience. Her small hands reached toward the mailbox as each letter disappeared into its depths, and those watching swore they saw the faintest glow emanate from within, not dramatic, but gentle as candlelight, the soft acknowledgement of sacred trust being honored. As evening settled over Willowmere with unusual tenderness, something extraordinary had become clear. The letters weren't disappearing into void, but transforming into something more powerful than delivery. They were becoming part of the town's collective understanding that some words need to exist not because they can reach their destination, but because the act of speaking them into the world creates space for healing that transcends every boundary between sender and recipient, between what was and what might yet be. Outside, the first stars appeared with unusual brightness, as if the universe itself was acknowledging that Willowmere had learned a new language of love, one that honored both the courage to speak and the grace of letting go, the necessity of expression and the wisdom of release, the profound truth that some gifts become more beautiful when offered without expectation of return. The gentle glow from the mailbox beneath the ancient oak had become as much a part of Willowmere's evening rhythm as the clock tower's chime, and in the months that followed, Luna's own presence began to shift in ways that spoke of seasons changing within her small heart. She moved now with the confident steps of a child, discovering that the world would not only hold her weight, but celebrate each footfall, her dark hair catching afternoon light like captured memories, and her humming carrying melodies that seemed to reach toward something beautiful, approaching on the horizon of their shared story. The changes announced themselves gently, as all meaningful transformations do in Willowmere. Luna's babbled conversations with invisible companions evolved into actual words that bridged the space between what was spoken and what was understood without language. Her small hands reached not just toward golden threads of connection, but toward the faces of friends who had become as essential to her development as sunlight to growing flowers. Ezra arrived at the library one afternoon with his satchel of collected silences, but something had shifted in how he carried them. Where once he had moved with the careful reverence of someone protecting precious secrets, he now approached with the confident grace of someone ready to share treasures with those who would understand their value. When he released the pause before understanding from a carefully labeled jar, Luna's humming rose to meet it, and together they created pockets of profound quiet, where people could hear their own wisdom speaking. Sage appeared moments later, her pocket watch ticking with the steady cadence that had become their shared timekeeper, but her eyes held the particular brightness of someone who had learned to see time not as a river flowing past, but as an ocean in which healing could happen at its own perfect pace. She and Luna would sit by the window, watching dust motes dance in golden light, practicing the art of letting moments stretch just enough to hold whatever gentleness they contained. Rowan joined them carrying his easel and canvas bag, but his paintings had evolved beyond individual portraits into something approaching maps of the heart's geography. Under Luna's influence, his brush found colors that existed only in the spaces between courage and comfort, painting not just how people looked when truly seen, but how the world appeared when viewed through eyes that had learned to witness without judgment. "We've been talking," Sage said, her voice carrying the careful weight of words chosen with great consideration, about how some friendships become deeper without becoming different. Her pocket watch ticked its gentle rhythm, helping the moment find its proper pacing within the larger symphony of their shared experience. Luna's humming began immediately, weaving through their gathering with threads that spoke of transformation without loss, growth without abandonment. As her melody filled the library's gentle quiet, something extraordinary became visible. The golden connections between them had strengthened and multiplied, revealing new patterns that honored both who they had been as children and who they were becoming as young people learning to carry their gifts with increasing confidence. Mrs. Hartwell appeared with tea that smelled like understanding and cookies shaped like small stars. She settled beside their growing circle, with the satisfied smile of someone who had watched seeds planted with love finally reveal their true nature. "You're learning," she said softly, "that the most beautiful part of growing up is discovering how to help others find what you've found." Luna's continuing humming wove through this recognition like a blessing, and everyone present felt it, the gentle shift from being helped to helping others, from receiving healing to offering it, from wondering about their place in the world to understanding that they were meant to make space for others to discover their own gifts. Outside, evening settled over Willowmere with the promise that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to practice this sacred art of growing into who they were meant to become. The understanding that had settled over their circle like a gentle benediction seemed to carry within it seeds of something larger, not an ending, but a transformation as natural as seasons changing or rivers finding their way to the sea. Luna, now speaking in complete sentences that bridged the visible and invisible worlds with equal grace, had begun to notice throughout Willowmere the particular expression that belonged to people carrying questions they couldn't quite articulate, seeking healing they couldn't quite name. It was during one of these observant mornings that Jamie from the flower shop appeared at the library's threshold, his young face etched with the careful worry of someone who felt too much and didn't know how to carry it gently. In his trembling hands, he held a rose whose petals had begun to droop not from lack of water, but from absorbing sorrows it was too small to hold. The grief of customers who bought flowers for graves, the loneliness of those who purchased bouquets for empty houses. "The flowers won't stop telling me their sadness," Jamie whispered, settling into the reading chair that had learned to position itself exactly where afternoon light would fall most warmly. "And I don't know how to help them feel better." Luna's response revealed how profoundly she had grown. Instead of immediately beginning to hum, she knelt beside Jamie with movements that spoke of recognition rather than solution. "Maybe," she said softly, "they don't need to feel better. Maybe they just need to feel heard." Her humming began then, but it was different now. Not the melody of someone offering healing, but the deeper harmony of someone teaching another to find their own rhythm of compassion. As her voice wove through the library's gentle quiet, Jamie's shoulders began to relax, and the rose in his hands seemed to settle into a more peaceful surrender. Ezra stepped forward with the intuitive understanding that had always guided their work together, releasing the pause between feeling and carrying from one of his carefully labeled jars. The silence that emerged created sacred space where Jamie could experience the flower's sorrow without taking responsibility for fixing it. Sage's pocket watch began to tick with a rhythm that helped him understand the difference between witnessing pain and absorbing it. "She doesn't take away the sadness," Jamie murmured, wonder brightening his features as he watched Luna's influence work its subtle magic. "She just helps it feel less alone." Rowan, observing from his place by the window, began to sketch not the wilting rose, but the invisible threads of empathy that connected Jamie's heart to every growing thing, and the luminous pathways that Luna's teaching was opening toward sustainable compassion. "You're learning to be a bridge," he said to Jamie, "not a sponge." As word of this new development spread through Willowmere's network of gentle conversations, others began to arrive seeking not miracles but guidance. Elena from the cafe came asking not for solutions, but for the particular presence that helped her remember joy, even when brewing hope felt difficult. Henrik the mapmaker brought his latest charts, seeking Luna's quiet wisdom to help him navigate the most compassionate routes through emotional territories that seemed particularly tangled. The children of Willowmere, who had once gathered around Luna's basket in simple wonder, now approached their circle with the reverent attention of students recognizing teachers. They learned from Ezra how to collect moments of peace without hoarding them, from Sage how to listen to time's patient wisdom, from Rowan how to witness beauty without needing to capture it. But Luna's greatest gift, they discovered, was not her unusual ability to hear the world's hidden songs, but her capacity to help others trust their own intuition about when to pause, when to breathe, when to let the world slow down enough for their inner wisdom to be heard. She had become not just a healer, but a teacher of healing, showing others how to carry their sensitivity as strength rather than burden. As evening settled over the library with the satisfaction of work that mattered, Luna's humming deepened into a lullaby for the quiet transformation happening throughout their community, the gentle recognition that true power lay not in fixing what seemed broken, but in helping others discover their own capacity to hold both sorrow and joy with equal grace, to be present with pain without drowning in it, to offer comfort without depleting themselves. Outside, the mailbox beneath the ancient oak seemed to pulse with unusual warmth, as if recognizing that the letters it held were about to be joined by something even more precious, the living messages that Luna and her friends were becoming as they learned to guide others toward the healing that had always existed within their own hearts, waiting patiently to be recognized and gently nurtured into bloom, the gentle transformation that had been rippling through Willowmere like circles. On still water seemed to gather itself into something approaching completion, as autumn painted the town in shades of amber and gold. Luna, now moving through her days with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to guide others toward their own inner wisdom, stood in the library where afternoon light fell with the particular sweetness that speaks of moments preparing to become memories. She was no longer the mysterious child who had arrived in the space between seconds, but neither had she lost the ancient calm that had marked her from the beginning. Her dark hair still caught starlight, her humming still wove golden threads through the air, but now these gifts served a deeper purpose, teaching others to recognize the healing that had always existed within their own hearts, waiting patiently to be discovered and nurtured into bloom. It was during one of these luminous afternoons that Sage appeared at the library's threshold, her pocket watch ticking with a rhythm that seemed to carry its own quiet celebration. Ezra walked beside her, his satchel of collected silences held not as protection but as offering, and in their joined presence was something that needed no explanation, the particular harmony that exists between two souls who have learned to breathe in perfect synchronization. "We've been talking," Sage said, her voice soft but resonating with the joy that comes from decisions made with complete certainty, about how some things don't need grand announcements to be true. Her eyes found Ezra's with the comfortable intimacy of those who had been having the same conversation in 1,000 different ways for years. "We're getting married," Ezra added, his words carrying the calm satisfaction of someone stating something that had always been inevitable. "Not because anything needs to change, but because we want to celebrate what's already here." Luna's response was immediate and profound. Her humming began with a melody that seemed to gather all the gentle threads of their shared history, childhood afternoons spent in comfortable silence, the patient way they had learned to translate each other's unique languages, the countless small moments when their hearts had recognized something essential in each other. It was not a song of new beginning, but of beautiful recognition. Mira approached with tears brightening her eyes, understanding that she was witnessing not just an engagement, but the culmination of something she had been privileged to watch unfold since Luna's arrival had taught them all new ways to see connection. Rowan appeared with his easel, but instead of preparing to paint, he simply settled into quiet witness, recognizing that some moments were too sacred to capture and could only be honored through complete presence. "We don't want something that feels like performance," Sage continued, her pocket watch ticking its steady rhythm against the palm of her hand. "We want something that feels like us, quiet, intentional, full of all the pauses and silences that brought us here." And so, guided by Luna's gentle wisdom and the community's collective understanding of what sacred celebration looked like in Willowmere, they began to prepare for a ceremony unlike any other. It would not be about grand pronouncements or elaborate rituals, but about honoring the subtle, beautiful architecture of a love that had grown in the spaces between heartbeats. Iris appeared with threads spun from starlight, teaching them to weave garlands not of traditional flowers, but of crystallized moments. The first time they had shared comfortable silence, the afternoon they had discovered they both collected beautiful pauses. The evening they had realized their individual gifts created something more beautiful when gently combined. Eleanor arrived from the cafe with ingredients for brewing hope into every cup that would be shared, while Maya brought seeds from the garden that would bloom into colors designed specifically for celebrating patient, enduring affection. The wedding itself took place at dawn in the Garden of Almost Was, where possibility had learned to bloom in colors that existed only when witnessed by hearts willing to see beyond the ordinary. Luna stood with them as the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, her humming weaving through the morning air to create sacred space where past, present and future could converge in gentle embrace. They called it, without discussion, the wedding of moments. Ezra opened a jar labeled, "The Pause Before Forever," and the silence that emerged settled around them like a blessing, holding the weight of their quiet vows in its sacred stillness. Sage lifted her pocket watch so it caught the morning light, and for several heartbeats time seemed to nod its approval, willing to stretch so that gratitude could find proper space to unfold. One by one, they honored the gentle milestones that had carried them toward each other. Ezra thanked the morning he had learned that some of life's most important conversations happened without words. Sage expressed gratitude for the afternoon she had discovered, that time could be shared rather than simply measured. They tied Iris's starlight threads to watch and satchel, visible promises that they would continue creating space for the quiet, miracles that had always been their love's foundation. Luna's melody cradled each vow without insisting on perfection, weaving through their words with the understanding that the most profound commitments were often the simplest ones. As the ceremony concluded, the entire community of Willowmere seemed to exhale with satisfaction, not because something had ended, but because something beautiful had been properly witnessed and celebrated. When they walked back through the town square, the doors along the streets opened and closed in gentle benediction. The mailbox beneath the ancient oak glowed with unusual warmth, and even the morning light seemed to fall more softly, as if the world itself was acknowledging that love, when nurtured with patience and expressed with reverence, became a gift, not just to those who shared it, but to everyone blessed enough to witness its quiet unfolding. Luna's humming followed them home, carrying within its gentle melody the promise that this joining was not conclusion but continuation, proof that the healing work they had all learned to share would be carried forward not through grand gestures, but through the countless small acts of attention and care that transform ordinary moments into sacred ones, ordinary love into something that teaches the world new languages of gentleness and grace. The gentle celebration of Sage and Ezra's wedding seemed to have planted seeds throughout Willowmere that bloomed in ways no one could have anticipated, though Luna felt the changes gathering like morning mist before anyone else noticed the shift. She moved through the autumn days following their ceremony with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that the most profound transformations often announced themselves not with fanfare, but with the subtle alteration of light, the way conversations began to carry different undertones, the particular quality of hope that settles over a community when it has learned to trust in its own capacity for wonder. It was Elena who first brought word of what was beginning to unfold throughout their town. She appeared at the library one morning, carrying not just her usual offering of warm bread, but the radiant exhaustion that belongs to those who have spent nights helping miracles find their way into the world. Her hands still carried the scent of lavender and new beginnings, and her eyes held the particular brightness of someone who had witnessed something that defied ordinary explanation. 3 families, she whispered, settling beside Luna with movements that spoke of profound reverence, each carrying new life, each baby arriving with gifts already visible, little ones who seemed to understand from their first breath that they belonged to a world ready to welcome their magic. Luna's response revealed how profoundly she had grown since her own mysterious arrival. Instead of immediately beginning to hum, she settled into listening with the patient attention of someone who had learned that true wisdom often meant creating space for others to discover their own insights. When her melody finally began, it wove through the library's morning quiet not as guidance but as recognition, acknowledging something beautiful that was already in motion. The news that touched them most deeply came through Sage's gentle announcement, delivered with the particular joy of someone who had learned to trust in life's capacity for gentle surprises. She and Ezra would welcome their own child with the turning of winter into spring, and the entire community seemed to exhale with satisfaction, as if this development had been written in starlight long before any of them had learned to read such celestial script. Luna found herself drawn toward a role she hadn't expected, not the healer. She had been in childhood, but something approaching a gentle midwife for the community's transformation. Her humming began to carry new melodies, designed specifically to welcome souls who were choosing to arrive in a world that had learned to nurture gifts from the very beginning. She helped anxious parents understand that their role was not to shape these new lives, but to recognize and celebrate the unique songs each child already carried. When Sage and Ezra's daughter arrived one soft morning, she came not with a cry but with a gentle sigh, as if she had been practicing peaceful breathing for months. They named her Aurelia, and her first breaths seemed to teach the very air around her how to hold more tenderness. Luna's humming rose to meet the baby's presence, harmonizing with new life in a melody that spoke of continuation rather than beginning, evolution rather than creation. Throughout the following months, other children followed, each birth a reminder that Willowmere had become something unprecedented, a place where magic was not discovered, but nurtured from birth, where gifts were recognized as natural expressions of souls, allowed to unfold without constraint. Luna learned to step back with increasing grace, offering presence rather than intervention, understanding that her greatest gift was not her unusual abilities, but her capacity to help others trust their own intuition about how to welcome wonder. As winter deepened around their transformed community, something beautiful had become clear. These new arrivals were not anomalies but harbingers, proof that when a town learns to celebrate its gifts rather than hide them, when it creates space for healing rather than demanding perfection, the very air becomes fertile ground for miracles to take root and flourish, with the patient certainty of seeds that have always known exactly when their season would arrive. The winter that settled over Willowmere carried within its quiet embrace an understanding that some seasons are meant for gathering close what has been given, and others for learning the sacred art of letting go with grace. Luna, now moving through her days with the profound wisdom of someone who had learned to recognize the deeper rhythms that govern all transitions, felt the approaching change like distant music, not sorrowful but deeply peaceful, the kind of melody that speaks of completion rather than ending. It was during one of these luminous afternoons, when frost painted the windows like delicate lace and the library's warmth felt particularly precious, that Iris appeared carrying not her usual basket of starlight threads, but a single white rose whose petals seemed to hold all the gentleness she had ever woven into the world. Her silver hair caught the low light with unusual luminescence, and her steps carried the particular grace of someone who had learned to walk between worlds with equal comfort in both. "Some gifts are meant to be given completely," she said, settling beside Luna with movements that spoke of profound peace, held lightly, and released with love when their season draws toward its natural close. Her hands, which had spun starlight into comfort for so many, now shimmered with an inner light that spoke of journeys yet to come. Henrik arrived shortly after, moving with the careful attention of someone whose navigation was taking him toward territories he had long been curious to explore. He carried his final map, not a chart of emotional landscapes, but something that looked remarkably like a pathway home, marked with symbols that spoke of rest earned through service, peace discovered through patient devotion to helping others find their way. Luna's response revealed the depth of wisdom she had gained. Her humming began not with the melody of someone trying to heal or change what was unfolding, but with the deeper harmony of someone learning to honor the natural rhythms that govern all life. As her voice wove through the library's gentle quiet, everyone present felt it. The profound rightness of seasons that knew their own timing, the understanding settled over their gathering like the gentlest of blessings. Both Iris and Henrik were preparing for the kind of journey that requires no luggage, but asks for the complete trust of hearts that have learned to recognize love in all its forms. They were not leaving Willowmere, but transitioning into a different kind of presence, one that would continue to guide and comfort in subtler ways. When their time came, it arrived as gently as evening light fading to stars. Iris slipped away while sitting in the garden of Almost Was, surrounded by flowers that bloomed in colors of eternal possibility. Henrik departed in his workshop, his weathered hands resting on a clock that had finally learned the perfect rhythm of peaceful silence. Luna helped the community understand that some presences become more powerful after they've moved beyond physical form. Her humming taught them that grief, when held with gentleness, was simply love with nowhere to go but deeper into the heart, where it could continue to nourish and sustain. The golden threads Iris had woven seemed to shimmer with renewed intensity, while Henrik's maps now contained luminous new pathways, showing that even beyond the visible horizon, there was always a way home. As winter deepened around their transformed community, Luna found herself collecting not objects but moments, the way comfort could be shared across any boundary, how wisdom continued to flow through every lesson, learned about creating space for healing. Outside, the mailbox beneath the ancient oak glowed with unusual warmth, acknowledging that some messages transcend every boundary between presence and memory, between the love we carry and the love that carries us forward into whatever gentle mysteries await our own patient. Unfolding, the profound peace that had settled over Willowmere following Iris and Henrik's gentle transition seemed to carry within it seeds of something Luna had been sensing for months, not an ending, but a careful gathering of what had been given, so it might continue to bloom in hearts not yet ready to receive such gifts. She moved through the winter days with the quiet purpose of someone who understood that the post-sacred work often involved creating spaces where healing could take root and flourish long after its original gardener had moved on to tend different soil. It was during one of these luminous afternoons, when the library's warmth felt particularly precious against winter's gentle insistence on rest, that Luna found herself drawn to a corner she had never fully explored. Here, where dust motes danced in slanted light and the air shimmered with patient possibilities, she began to understand what was being asked of her, not to hold on to the healing she had facilitated, but to help it learn to live and grow in many hands. Mira watched this recognition unfold with the profound satisfaction of someone who had been privileged to witness a miracle learning to understand its own purpose. Together they cleared the space with reverent care, bringing in a long wooden table that seemed to know how to hold both memories and hopes, setting out baskets woven from reeds that had grown beside still water, placing an old clock whose pendulum had learned the art of restful silence. "Not a museum," Luna whispered, her fingers tracing patterns in the air that seemed to leave golden traces, but a garden where gentleness remembers how to grow. And so they began to gather, not objects but essences. The way comfort felt when shared between strangers, the particular quality of light that appeared when someone truly listened, the invisible threads that connected every act of kindness to every heart, brave enough to receive it. Ezra arrived with his satchel, carefully releasing the silences he had collected over the years into spaces where they were most needed, the pause before forgiveness settling like morning mist in one corner, the breath before understanding warming the chair by the window. Sage mapped where each essence rested best, her pocket watch ticking its patient rhythm as she noted how hope preferred the eastern wall at dawn and how courage gathered strength near the door at twilight, Elena brought simple food, wrapped in waxed paper and tied with string, sandwiches. That tasted like being cared for, tea that smelled like second chances. Maya contributed herbs that released memory when touched, rosemary for gratitude that had been forgotten, mint for clarity that needed refreshing, lavender for peace that wanted to be shared. Rowan painted not what could be seen but what could be felt, the way shoulders dropped when burdens were acknowledged, the soft brightness that appeared at the edges of conversations that had found their truest words. They organized everything not by date or name, but by the heart's own geography, relief beside relief, trust next to trust, joy nestled where it could warm someone who had forgotten how to hope. People began to arrive, understanding without explanation that this was a place where their own gentle moments could be both offered and received. Some brought written memories of kindness witnessed or given. Others simply pressed their palms to the wooden table until their breathing steadied, leaving that peace in the wood's grain for whoever might need it next. Young Aurelia, taking her first determined steps between the reading chairs, seemed drawn to this work with the intuitive understanding that belongs to souls who arrive already knowing their purpose. When her tiny hands touched the golden threads Luna was weaving through the archive, something beautiful occurred. The entire space began to pulse with renewed warmth, as if recognizing that it was being entrusted to the next generation of gentle guardians. As winter deepened around their transformed community, the archive breathed with Willowmere's collective exhale, teaching everyone who entered that healing was not something to be hoarded, but something that grew stronger when shared. Luna learned to step back with increasing grace, understanding that her greatest gift was not her unusual abilities, but her capacity to help others trust their own intuition about how to tend the spaces where peace wanted. Let it take root. The archive became a living seed bank where the essence of every gentle moment could be preserved and planted in future hearts, not as memory, but as possibility, not as what had been accomplished, but as what continued to unfold in the endless, luminous present where all true healing made its home. Outside, the mailbox beneath the ancient oak seemed to pulse with recognition, acknowledging that some gifts transcend every boundary between what has been given and what continues to grow in the patient soil of willing hearts. The archive of gentle moments had learned to breathe with its own rhythm, no longer requiring Luna's constant tending, but pulsing with the collected warmth of countless hearts that had discovered healing in its quiet corners. Luna, now moving through her days with the profound grace of someone who had learned that the greatest gift was teaching others to find their own light, watched this evolution with the tender satisfaction of a gardener whose seeds had taken root in soil rich enough to sustain them without daily intervention. She stood by the tall windows where afternoon light painted golden rectangles across the worn wooden table, observing as Aurelia, now steady on her feet and bright with curiosity, moved between the baskets of collected silences with the intuitive understanding that belonged to souls born into a world ready to celebrate their gifts. The child's small hands traced the invisible threads that still shimmered through the air, and when she hummed in response to their gentle vibrations, Luna felt the profound rightness of watching wonder pass from one generation to the next. Ezra appeared with his satchel, but his movements had evolved from the careful protection of precious secrets to the confident sharing of someone who understood that silence grew stronger when offered freely. He knelt beside a young boy named Finn, who had arrived carrying a smooth stone that seemed to pulse with the earth's own quiet heartbeat. "Listen," Ezra whispered, releasing the pause before understanding into the air around them, not for what you expect to hear, but for what's already singing. Luna's humming began then, not as guidance but as recognition, harmonizing with the stone's silent song, and teaching Finn that his gift was not something to be developed, but something to be trusted. As her melody wove through the archive's gentle quiet, she felt the subtle shift that had been growing within her for months, the understanding that her role was transforming from healer to something more essential, more pervasive. Sage entered carrying little Aurelia's hand, her pocket watch ticking with the patient rhythm that had become their community's shared timekeeper. Behind them came Rowan, his silver-streaked hair catching the light, and Mira, moving with the careful grace of someone whose years had taught her to treasure each moment of witnessing such profound unfolding. They gathered around the long table not for ceremony, but for the simple joy of being present with each other, understanding without words that something beautiful was completing itself. "She's becoming part of everything," Aurelia whispered, her young voice carrying the matter-of-fact wonder of someone who had never known a world without magic. Her small finger pointed toward Luna, and everyone present could see it. The way the golden threads that had always surrounded her were beginning to extend outward, connecting not just to the people in the room, but to every threshold in Willowmere, every garden gate, every space where gentleness had learned to make its home. Luna felt this expansion not as loss of self, but as discovery of what she had always been meant to become. Her reflection in the tall mirror by the door showed not just her physical form, but the living network of peace she had helped weave throughout their community, threads of connection that pulsed with their own light, no longer dependent on her presence, but strengthened by the countless hearts that had learned to recognize healing when they encountered it, as evening approached with the particular tenderness that belonged to moments preparing to become memories. Luna began to sense something she hadn't felt since her arrival in the space between seconds, the gentle pull of deeper mysteries, the invitation to explore territories that existed beyond the visible horizon. But this time the calling felt not like departure, but like expansion. Not like ending, but like the natural progression of someone whose work had grown too large for any single form to contain. Outside, the mailbox beneath the ancient oak seemed to pulse with recognition, acknowledging that some gifts transcend every boundary between presence and memory, between the love we carry and the love that carries us forward into whatever gentle transformations await our own patient unfolding into the infinite spaces where all true healing makes its eternal home. The archive of gentle moments breathed with its own rhythm now, no longer requiring Luna's constant tending, but pulsing with the collected warmth of countless hearts that had discovered healing in its quiet corners. Luna stood by the tall windows, where afternoon light painted golden rectangles across the worn wooden table, watching as Aurelia moved between the baskets of collected silences with intuitive understanding. The child's small hands traced invisible threads that still shimmered through the air, and when she hummed in response to their gentle vibrations, Luna felt the profound rightness of watching wonder pass from one generation to the next. The understanding that had been gathering like morning light finally reached its fullness. Luna's reflection in the tall windows showed not departure but transformation, the way seeds disappear into earth only to become forests, the way starlight becomes part of the darkness it illuminates. Her humming began one final time, but now it seemed to emerge not just from her throat, but from every surface that had ever held her presence. Mira approached with tears that held no sadness, recognizing that she was witnessing not an ending, but the most beautiful kind of beginning. Ezra appeared with his satchel, understanding without words that this moment required not preservation, but release. Sage entered carrying Aurelia's hand, her pocket watch ticking with the patient rhythm that had become their community's shared heartbeat. As Luna's melody filled the library's gentle quiet, something extraordinary occurred. The golden threads that had always connected heart to heart began to shimmer with renewed intensity, revealing that what they had thought was Luna's magic had always been their own capacity for healing. Simply awakened and nurtured by her patient presence, the transformation completed itself as gently as sunset becoming stars. Where Luna had stood, the air shimmered with the particular quality of light that appears when peace has found its perfect home. Her humming continued, but now it emerged from everywhere and nowhere, from the whispered conversations between books, from the patient ticking of clocks that had learned to measure time with kindness, from the soft percussion of doors opening to welcome hearts that needed sanctuary. Outside, the mailbox beneath the ancient oak pulsed with unusual warmth, while the clock tower's hands pointed toward midnight with patient anticipation. Luna had returned to the space between seconds where she had always belonged. But now that space lived everywhere, in every pause before kindness, every breath before understanding, every gentle moment when the world remembered how to hold its children with infinite love. Years would pass, and children would grow up in Willowmere, never knowing a world without the particular quality of peace that lived in their air like invisible flowers always in bloom. And sometimes, when the light fell just right through library windows, People would swear they could still hear her humming, not as echo but as presence, teaching the universe itself how to stretch each moment just enough to hold all the healing any heart could ever need. And somewhere, in the space between seconds, she's still out there, humming the world to gentleness. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay.